One, two. So movies have been around for a while now, about 150 years, I think, since the first things that are considered to be movies. And the medium has evolved in a lot of ways to become a lot of different styles and genres. And along the way, a lot of different countries have made sizable contributions to the film canon as a whole. I wanted to talk about some of what I would consider to be the best, and throw in some personal favorites as honorable mentions. This is not meant to be like a competition. You can't objectively rank any of these countries in terms of their overall quality or contribution, but I still think it's fun to recognize the history and what countries have made significant contributions, even if you can't verify that they're the absolute best. This is also not meant to touch on every single country that's helped to develop film, because that would probably require some segment on just about every country that's ever had a significant film industry. And, well, I'm just not ready for that. We'll focus on 10 total, the top 5, but also 5 personal picks for film histories that I think are enjoy or especially noteworthy that aren't in the top 5. So I have 2 basic goals. The first is to bring light to those special mentions, a couple of which are personal favorites and a couple of which are significant in modern film that don't necessarily get as much shine in the mainstream, perhaps. And then the other one, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of, what might be more important, having a legendary director or having sort of long, consistent success over a longer period of time, in terms of, importance to film as a whole, or perhaps in terms of what is impressive for a country to accomplish. I will also mention that I'm not trying to be exhaustive with these histories, because any country I get into could have, its own hour-plus long video going over its history and significant examples and things like that. So I'm not trying to talk about everything or every notable director or movie. And if you would like to bolster a country's case of your own, then feel free to comment that, something that you feel is significant, another country I left out, perhaps. So for this, I put together a spreadsheet to try to give myself a bit of a baseline for what countries could qualify. I had an idea in mind already for what the top 5 were, and they did end up being the top 5 that I settled on. So I went off the Sight and Sound list, both the critics list and the directors list, and I put together some, ultimately arbitrary weights for both of them, and for some bonuses that I chose, be it number of directors, number of times the director appears, or just some personal picks, some personal favorite directors that I wish could have been on these lists that I gave some bonus points for. So these are just a approximate ranking for a starting point, right? The Sight and Sound lists are limited to 100 movies, at least the ones I looked at. I know the critics list has a 250, but this is limited to the very best of the very best, and you're leaving out a ton of movies, obviously, if you're limiting yourself to just 100. So this is kind of like a glimpse at perhaps the perceived quality of a country's peak output. France, Italy, Russia, Japan, that was the top 5 that I more or less expected. I'm not going to have them in exactly that order. They will all be in the second video where I'll go over the top 5. And honorable mention number 1 is Senegal. Senegal, as you can see from the list here, 2 different entries on the critics list, 1 entry on the directors list. And I think that Senegal is noteworthy not just for perhaps bearing the cinematic standard for a whole continent that does not have much of a cinematic reputation, but also for punching above its weight class in a certain sense. In terms of, you could call it cinematic impact per capita or something like that. Senegal is extremely impressive. And the primary directors representing Senegal are Sembène Ousmane and Djibril Diop Mambéty. They're represented on this list by Black Girl and Touki Bouki, respectively. I'm specifically a fan of Sembène Ousmane. I've seen most of his films. I hope to finish watching all of them at some point, even though one of them seems to be particularly hard to find. Love Sembène Ousmane. Djibril Diop Mambéty also made Hyenas. These directors' work is a great entry point into African cinema in general. I think African cinema specifically is fascinating in terms of giving such a different portrait of life compared to mine. The first African film I watched was Mandabi by Sembène Ousmane, and I loved it. It was just fascinating to see, one, the way people live slash lived, I guess, because it was the 60s, in such a different way. But also how certain themes and ideas the film communicates are apparently so universal, because you see the same ideas of sort of, futility against bureaucracy and government throughout time, certainly now, certainly in different continents from Africa. So I would highly recommend their work, even if I'm not as huge a fan of Djibril Diop Mambéty. He has made some really poignant and fascinating stuff. And then, even if you get beyond Senegal, Africa in general has definitely some gems in its collective film history. Especially more recently, Eyimofe and This Is Not a Burial, This Is a Resurrection are a couple more recent African favorites, not directly related to Senegal, but just to use it as a point to broaden things to Africa in general. Watch African films. They're very interesting. Honorable mention number 2 is Sweden. And I bring up Sweden to kind of talk about that point I mentioned earlier about what's more impressive, having legendary director or having a long, consistent history. In the combined sight and sound results, you can see Sweden is, by my arbitrary method, comes in number 7, and that's all Bergman. Bergman's reputation is stellar for good reason. He always, I haven't watched a ton of his movies yet. I am working my way through some of his history. It's just impressive. He always manages to make compelling, well-constructed, aesthetically pleasing films that are also so compact. There's nothing wrong with long movies, obviously. It is interesting how much he manages to get out of his short runtime. And of course, him and Sven Nykvist, his longtime collaborator as a DOP, just a match made in heaven. But anyway, there's been plenty done on Bergman. I don't need to get into him. But he is obviously an extreme high point in a country's film history. And there are a couple of other countries on here, such as Belgium, who is represented by Chantal Akerman, and Iran, who is represented by Abbas Kiarostami. This is not to say that those are the only, good films that those countries have ever produced, but it is interesting, this idea that, these countries are elevated so much by a representative. Personally, to me, it's more impressive if a country has a longer, consistent history, because that almost feels like the country's culture, or perhaps just government, is fostering a culture of cinema that is encouraging more directors to come across. And, perhaps there are good schools or something like that. And this kind of thing probably builds on itself. I think we've seen the fruits of this in a place like Korea, where the government has significantly invested in the film industry. Korea is a hotspot of cinema right now. So I just think it's fun to consider the difference between the two. Neither really matters. Again, it's just whatever your personal criteria are. But I do think it's interesting to think of a country like any of these three, really, that have high points, and there is not as much that is, mainstream known about the country's film history. But the other thing I wanted to talk about with Sweden is Victor Sjöström, who I believe is also a cinematic legend in his own right. I would consider him to be the best silent film director that I have watched thus far, at least. Oh, and also, to his credit, he is not just an accomplished director, he is also an accomplished actor. And a little bit of crossover, he also starred in Bergman's Wild Strawberries for perhaps his most well-known role. He also starred in some of his own productions. But he made films like The Wind and A Man There Was and Phantom Carriage and other shorts earlier on in his career. Really compelling stuff. Phantom Carriage, it's almost like a more haunting Christmas carol. And A Man There Was, haunting in its own right, has a wonderful atmosphere to it. The Wind, again, this guy knew atmosphere. The Wind is absolutely, oppressive in its location and the way that reinforces its loneliness of the main character. Love Victor Sjöström. Kind of wish he had more shine on the overall scene. I don't know how much exposure he gets, but this is my push for him to be considered as one of the great directors, especially of the silent era. Honorable mention 3, Czechoslovakia. And honestly, I should probably just make a separate video on Czechoslovakia. I haven't watched enough, honestly, but I've just been so fascinated by what I have watched, especially from the 60s and 70s. The Czech New Wave is probably the country's biggest claim to fame, for good reason. There was a lot of fascinating work done at that time period. But not even all of the country's output from the 60s and 70s that is noteworthy is from the New Wave. As a personal pick, I'm probably going to struggle with some of these names, but I think I might have them down. František Vlachil did some incredibly poetic filmmaking with like The White Dove, one of my favorite shot movies I've ever seen. Stefan Uher's The Sun in the Net, another beautifully shot movie. Stefan Uher also did Marketa Lazarova, which is often considered to be the best Czech film. I believe that was 1968. One of my favorite movies, one of my favorite comedies, Happy End, directed by Oldrich Lipsky. 1967, not part of the New Wave as far as I know. That director also made a kind of fascinating movie called Lemonade Joe, which is a bit of a send-up of American Westerns. Ikarie XB is a sci-fi film, 1963. It is perhaps an influence of 2001. I love that movie. It looks beautiful, fascinating sci-fi content. Really great set design as well. I love the sort of near-futuristic space design of the ship. And then the New Wave itself, its biggest claim to fame, a lot of really interesting political works. And also, alongside the political works, some bizarre and engaging presentation. I'll pick two films specifically. One is more critically known, and one is just a fascinating trip. The critical one would be something like The Cremator, which is well received, well liked, clear political ideas in it. And then you can also pick like Birds, Orphans, and Fools, which is fascinating. It's bizarre. It doesn't quite feel real. Or even something like A Report on the Party and the Guests, which is perhaps more straightforward, but still strange, still clearly very figurative, still clearly very political in the way it comes across. And then even beyond the 60s and 70s, or before the 60s and 70s, really, Carl Zeman, who is an extremely creative filmmaker, doing movies like The Fabulous Baron Munchausen, lovely visual content and that stuff, just extremely imaginative. And the work he did for special effects is really wonderful. Honorable mention 4, Taiwan. Taiwanese New Wave, I think, is big in indie circles because you have, at least on the list, you have Edward Yang represented. His two movies there are Brighter Summer Day and Yi Yi. He's not the only one. Tsai Ming-lang is also a notable filmmaker from here. There's a whole crop of filmmakers from the 80s through the 90s. Even Ang Lee initially came from Taiwan himself. And Ho Xiaoxian, a favorite filmmaker of mine who made Flowers of Shanghai. A lot of beautiful stuff coming from here. If you haven't seen any Taiwanese New Wave films, yeah, definitely check out. I think Yi is more approachable, we'll say, than Brighter Summer Day, given that it's not 4 hours long. So I would recommend that, but also something like Millennium Mambo by Ho Xiaoxian. And then the last honorable mention is Hong Kong, who is only represented on the list by Wong Kar-wai, which is fine, really. He is another cinematic legend who has created some beautiful, extremely stylistic films. But again, Wong Kar-wai's reputation precedes him. The other aspect of Hong Kong, which is not represented on this list, is their martial arts history, their action film history. This was in the form of what was called wuxia, which was kind of the earlier style before they hit on kung fu films, which exploded. Wuxia was more swords and spiritualism, and kung fu is, kung fu. Could be more serious, could be more comedic, depending on, the leading man in question. The most famous are obviously Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, Jet Li, and some notable directors are John Woo, Tsui Hark, and the Shaw Brothers. The Shaw Brothers were more the wuxia, and then the other two got into more of the kung fu style. But Hong Kong cinema has been extremely influential in action, perhaps most notably for The Matrix. So those are the 5 interesting countries I think are good to be mentioned, even if they're not as perhaps rich and consistent as what might be our top 5. I'm going to do a sun cut right here as we transition into the